For 9 hours, it had refused to die, surrounded, outnumbered, battered by anti-tank rounds that should have turned it into scrap metal. The Tiger stood alone on a nameless ridge south of Prokhorovka, its gun still firing, its engine still running, and inside 5 German tankers who had stopped counting the enemy and started counting the minutes until the inevitable end, July 12th, 1943. The southern Russian steppe stretched endlessly beneath a colorless summer sky, the horizon blurred by heat and dust and the smoke of 1,000 burning vehicles. This was Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history, a collision of steel and fire involving more than 6,000 armored vehicles, 2 million men, and the fate of the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel, Germany's last major offensive in the East, had ground to a halt in the killing fields around Prokhorovka. The Wehrmacht's dream of encircling Soviet forces in a massive pincer movement had collapsed into a brutal war of attrition, where tanks fought at ranges so close that crews could see each other's faces before they died. The Germans were exhausted, bleeding strength with every passing hour. The Soviets were relentless, throwing wave after wave of T-34s and infantry into the German lines with a ferocity born of desperation and hatred. And somewhere in the middle of this maelstrom, on a low ridge overlooking a shallow ravine choked with wrecked tanks and dead men, sat Tiger 205, a Panzerkampfwagen 6 AUSV, 56 tons of German heavy armor, commanded by Hauptmann Klaus Müller. Müller was 31 years old that summer, a Bavarian from a family of carpenters who had volunteered for the Panzerwaffe in 1939 because he understood machines the way some men understood music. He was not a Nazi ideologue, not a believer in grand visions of conquest or racial destiny. He was a technician, a practical man who saw the Tiger not as a weapon of ideology but as a tool, complex, powerful, and temperamental. He knew every rivet, every gear, every weakness in its design, and he knew that even the best tool could fail if pushed beyond its limits. The Tiger. I was the most feared tank on any battlefield in 1943. Its 88mm KWK-36 gun could destroy any Allied or Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its frontal armor, 100 millimeters thick, sloped and hardened, was virtually impenetrable to most enemy weapons. It was a mobile fortress designed to dominate, to kill from distance, to survive what would destroy lesser machines. But it was also a maintenance nightmare. It was slow, maximum road speed of 23 miles per hour, slower cross-country. It consumed fuel at an astonishing rate, 100 liters per 100 kilometers, which meant a Tiger could drain its fuel tanks in 2 hours of combat maneuvering. Its gearbox was fragile, its overlapping road wheels prone to freezing in winter or clogging with mud, and it was expensive. Each Tiger cost as much as 4 Panzer IV or 7 Stug Thurs assault guns. By July of 1943, Germany was losing the war of production. For every Tiger that rolled off the Henschel assembly line, the Soviets were producing a dozen T-34s. The Americans were building hundreds of Shermans. The Germans could afford to lose tanks only if those tanks took 10 or 20 enemy vehicles with them. Anything less was a strategic defeat. Tiger 205 had been in combat since the opening day of Operation Citadel, July 5th. Miller's crew had fought through minefields, survived ambushes by Soviet anti-tank guns, and destroyed, according to the careful tally kept by the loader, 17 enemy tanks. Müller did not celebrate these kills. Each one was a problem solved, a threat neutralized. He recorded them in his log with the same matter-of-fact precision he used to record fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure. The crew of Tiger 205 had become a single organism over months of combat. The driver, Unteroffizier Hans Becker, was a former mechanic from Stuttgart who could nurse a damaged engine through conditions that would have stopped other tanks cold. The radio operator and bow gunner, Gefreiter Otto Klein, was a quiet 18-year-old from Saxony who had joined the Wehrmacht to escape his father's farm, and now spent every waking moment wishing he was back there. The loader, Obergefreiter Franz Weber, was built like a blacksmith, thick arms, broad shoulders, and could load the heavy 88mm shells with a rhythm that never faltered even when the interior of the tank was filled with smoke and the deafening concussion of the gun. And the gunner, Unteroffizier Ernst Schaefer, had the best eyes in the battalion, a hunter's instinct for spotting movement, for reading terrain, for calculating range without instruments. They trusted Müller because he had kept them alive, and they feared what would happen if their luck ran out. On the morning of July 12th, Tiger 205 was part of a hastily organized counterattack intended to blunt a Soviet breakthrough. The battalion had been reduced to 11 operational Tigers from an original complement of 14. Ammunition was running low. Fuel was rationed. The infantry that normally supported the tanks had been decimated. But orders were orders, and the Tigers rolled forward into a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, cratered, burned, littered with the wreckage of previous battles. The counterattack began at 0600 hours. For 3 hours, the Tigers advanced slowly across open ground, engaging Soviet tanks and anti-tank positions at long range. Müller's Tiger destroyed 4 T-34s in the first hour, methodical kills at distances where the Soviet tanks couldn't effectively return fire. But as the morning wore on, the Soviets adapted. They stopped trying to fight at range and instead closed the distance, using terrain and smoke to mask their approach, accepting horrific losses to get near enough for their 76mm guns to penetrate German armor. By noon, the German counterattack had stalled. 3 Tigers were burning. The remaining 8 were scattered across a 5-kilometer front, each fighting isolated actions against swarms of enemy armor. Müller's Tiger had been separated from the rest of the battalion when the engine of a nearby Tiger threw a track, and Müller stopped to provide covering fire while the crew attempted repairs. That decision saved the disabled Tiger, but cost Müller his escape route. At 1300 hours, Müller realized they were surrounded. Soviet tanks, T-34s and some of the newer T-34-85s with improved guns, had maneuvered around both flanks while he was covering the disabled Tiger. Now they were closing in from 3 sides, advancing in small groups, using the terrain to mask their movements. Müller counted at least 20 enemy tanks, possibly more hidden in the smoke and dust. The radio crackled with fragmentary transmissions from other German units, all of them reporting contact, all of them calling for support that didn't exist. Müller tried to raise battalion headquarters, but got only static. They were on their own. "Schaefer," Müller said quietly, "how many rounds do we have left?" The gunner didn't need to check. 14 armor-piercing, 6 high-explosive, 1 smoke, 21 rounds, 20 enemy tanks. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Becker, the driver, spoke for the first time in an hour, his voice tight. "Herr Hauptmann, we can't fight them all. We need to withdraw." Müller did not panic. Schaefer, target left, range 1,000, lead tank. Identified. Fire. The 88-millimeter gun roared, the breech slamming backward, the interior of the tank filling with the acrid stench of burnt propellant. Through his periscope, Müller watched the tracer arc across the steppe and strike the lead T-34 just below the turret. The Soviet tank erupted in flames, slewing sideways, blocking the path of the tank behind it. Target right, range 1,200, moving tank. Schaefer adjusted, tracked the target, compensated for movement. On target. Fire. The second T-34 died before it traveled another 50 meters, penetrated through the frontal armor, ammunition detonating in a pillar of fire and smoke. The remaining 6 T-34s split into 2 groups, 3 angling left, 3 right, trying to flank the Tiger. It was the correct response. Divide the enemy's fire, attack from multiple angles. But it also spread them out, made them individual targets instead of a concentrated force. Weber, load AP, continuous fire. The loader worked like a machine, pulling shells from the ready rack, slamming them into the breech, tapping Schaefer's shoulder to signal ready. The Tiger's gun fired every 12 seconds, slow by the standards of lighter tanks. But each shot was deliberate, aimed, lethal. Third T-34, dead at 900 meters. Fourth T-34, track, destroyed at 800 meters, immobilized, finished with a second shot. Fifth T-34, penetrated through the side armor as it tried to maneuver around a shell crater. Sixth T-34, killed at 600 meters, so close that Müller could see the crew bailing out before the tank exploded. The last 2 T-34s broke off the attack and retreated, trailing smoke. 8 enemy tanks in 4 minutes. 6 destroyed, 1 immobilized, 1 damaged. 14 rounds expended, 7 rounds remaining. Inside Tiger 205, the air was thick with smoke and heat. Weber's face was black with powder residue. Schaefer's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline, from the physical strain of acquiring target after target without pause. Klein was coughing, his eyes streaming from the smoke. Becker sat frozen at the controls, listening to the engine, praying it wouldn't overheat. Müller allowed them 30 seconds. Reload ready rack, drink water, check ammunition. They had 7 armor-piercing rounds left, 6 high explosive, 1 smoke round, and the Soviets were regrouping. The second attack came from 2 directions simultaneously, 10 T-34s from the east, another 6 from the south. The Soviets had learned. They were using smoke now, laying down a screen to obscure their advance. They were moving faster, more aggressively, accepting losses to close the distance. Müller made a decision that defied every principle of armored warfare. Becker, reverse off the ridge, back slope, now. The driver hesitated. Herr Hauptmann, do it. The Tiger lurched backward, descending the reverse slope of the ridge until only the cupola was visible from the front. To the advancing Soviets, the Tiger appeared to have withdrawn, retreated, perhaps damaged, perhaps out of ammunition. The T-34s accelerated, racing to crest the ridge before the Tiger could escape, and Müller waited. He counted seconds, watching through the cupola periscope as the Soviet tanks closed the distance. 800 meters, 700, 600. The lead tanks reached the base of the ridge and began climbing. their hulls angled upward, bellies exposed. Becker, forward, crest the ridge. The Tiger surged forward, engine roaring, climbing back up the slope, turret appearing over the ridgeline like a predator emerging from ambush. The Soviet tanks were 30 meters away, their commanders frozen in shock, their gunners unable to depress their guns low enough to engage a target so close and so high. Schaefer, point blank, fire at will. The Tiger's gun became an execution weapon. At ranges where a miss was impossible, Schaefer fired into the thin top armor of the T-34s, each shot punching through and detonating inside the cramped crew compartments. The first 3 Soviet tanks were destroyed before they could reverse. The fourth tried to turn, but threw a track and slid sideways, blocking the others. The fifth took a round through the engine deck and burned. The remaining Soviet tanks broke and ran. But the southern attack was still coming. Müller traversed the turret, scanning for targets. 6 T-34s, 400 meters and closing, spread out in a line, firing on the move. Rounds whined past the Tiger, one striking the turret with a clang that rang through the interior like a bell. The armor held, but the impact left a bright scar on the steel. Schaefer, rapid fire, pick your targets. The gunner worked mechanically, acquiring, firing, reloading, firing again. 2 T-34s exploded. A third took a hit that shattered its track and left it spinning in circles. But the remaining 3 were inside 300 meters now, close enough that their guns could penetrate the Tiger's side armor if they got the angle. And Tiger 205 was down to 3 armor-piercing rounds. Müller made the calculation instantly. 3 rounds, 3 targets, no margin for error. Schaefer, center tank, now on target. Fire. The center T-34 died. Left tank, fire. The left T-34 exploded. 1 round left. The last T-34 was 200 meters away, its gun traversing toward the Tiger, the Soviet gunner lining up the shot that would end the duel. Schaefer centered the reticle, held his breath, and squeezed the trigger. The 88-millimeter round crossed the distance in a fraction of a second and struck the T-34's turret ring, the weakest point in the tank's armor. The turret lifted off the hull and crashed down 10 meters away. Silence. Müller scanned the battlefield. 24 enemy tanks lay burning or destroyed within a kilometer of the ridge. The steppe was littered with wrecks, smoke rising in black columns toward the gray sky. Ammunition status, Müller said quietly. 6 high explosive, 1 smoke, 0 armor piercing, Weber reported. Klein's voice cracked. Herr Hauptmann, more tanks. East side. At least 6, maybe more. Müller looked. 6 T-34s were forming up in the distance, preparing for another assault, and Tiger 205 had no armor-piercing ammunition left. For the next 5 hours, Tiger 205 fought a different kind of battle. Without armor-piercing rounds, Müller couldn't destroy enemy tanks with direct hits. But he could suppress them. The high-explosive shells, designed for use against fortifications and infantry, could still damage optics, tracks, and external equipment. More importantly, they could terrify. Müller fired the HE rounds at maximum range, aiming not to kill, but to disrupt, to force the Soviet crews to button up, to make them cautious. He used the smoke round to obscure the Tiger's position, then repositioned on the ridge to fire from a different angle, creating the illusion of multiple tanks. He ordered Klein to broadcast false radio traffic on German frequencies, hoping Soviet intelligence would intercept it and believe reinforcements were approaching. It was all theater, all deception, all desperation. But it worked. The Soviet attacks became hesitant, probing, unsure. The T-34 commanders, having watched 24 of their comrades die on the same ridge, approached cautiously, expecting ambush, expecting the tiger's gun to bark again with lethal accuracy. As the afternoon faded into evening, the Soviet pressure eased. A German reconnaissance patrol pushing forward to locate the missing tiger found Miller's tank still on the ridge, still operational, surrounded by a graveyard of Soviet armor. Tiger 205 was extracted after nightfall, towed back to a forward repair depot by a recovery vehicle. The tank had been hit 17 times. Rounds that had scarred the armor, damaged the tracks, shattered periscopes, but not penetrated. The engine was on the verge of failure, overheated and leaking oil. The gun barrel was dangerously worn from continuous firing, but the crew was alive. Müller climbed out of the cupola and stood on the turret, looking back at the ridge in the darkness. He didn't speak. Around him, the crew descended from the tank in silence, their movements slow, mechanical, as if they were sleepwalking. Weber sat on the ground and didn't move for 10 minutes. Klein vomited. Schaefer lit a cigarette with shaking hands and smoked it down to the filter without saying a word. A colonel from division headquarters arrived an hour later to debrief Müller. The colonel wanted details, enemy tank types, ranges, ammunition expenditure, tactical observations. Müller provided the information in a flat monotone, answering questions with the precision of a man filling out a maintenance report. When the colonel asked how many enemy tanks Müller believed his crew had destroyed, Müller paused. 24 confirmed, possibly more disabled. The colonel stared. 24? In one engagement? Yes, Herr Oberst. And your casualties? None. The colonel recommended Müller for the Knight's Cross. Müller accepted the recommendation without comment, knowing that medals were political tools, symbols the Reich used to maintain morale when the war was already lost. Tiger 205 was repaired and returned to service 2 weeks later. Müller and his crew climbed back into the same tank and continued fighting, because that was what soldiers did. They fought until they couldn't fight anymore, or until the war ended, or until they died. The battle on the ridge was never officially named. It didn't appear in grand histories of the Battle of Kursk, didn't earn a place in the textbooks alongside Prokhorovka or the fighting around Poniri. It was simply one engagement among thousands, one tiger among hundreds, one crew doing their duty on a day when duty meant refusing to die. Klaus Müller survived the war. He was captured by American forces in April of 1945 and spent 2 years in a POW camp before being released. He returned to Bavaria, took over his father's carpentry business, and lived quietly for the next 4 decades. He married, had children, and rarely spoke about the war except to say that he had done what was asked of him and was grateful to have survived. In 1987, a historian researching the Battle of Kursk discovered the after-action reports from Müller's battalion and contacted him, asking for an interview. Müller agreed, reluctantly, and spent an afternoon recounting the details of July 12, 1943. When the historian asked how it felt to have accomplished what many considered impossible, holding off repeated Soviet attacks alone, destroying 24 enemy tanks with a single Tiger, Müller was silent for a long time. It wasn't courage, he finally said. It was just, we couldn't leave, and if we couldn't leave, we had to fight. And if we had to fight, we had to fight well, because fighting poorly meant dying. So we fought well. He paused. but mostly we were terrified. Ernst Schaefer, the gunner, became a machinist in East Germany after the war. He and Müller exchanged letters occasionally, brief notes that mentioned family and weather, but never the war. Schaefer died in 1991. At his funeral, his son found a photograph tucked inside his father's Bible. 5 men standing in front of a Tiger tank, young and exhausted, their faces blank with the 1,000-yard stare common to men who had seen too much. Franz Weber, the loader, emigrated to Canada and worked as a steel worker. He never spoke about his service, and his children learned about it only after his death in 2003, when they found his discharge papers among his belongings. Hans Becker and Otto Klein both died in the final months of the war. Becker killed when his Tiger was destroyed near Berlin in April 1945. Klein killed by Soviet infantry during the retreat from Hungary. Müller attended memorial services for both men after the war, standing in civilian churches far from the battlefields, listening to pastors who had never known them speak in generalities about sacrifice and duty. The Tiger itself, number 205, was likely scrapped for metal after the war, its steel recycled into plowshares or automobiles or bridge girders, its history erased by the practicalities of reconstruction. No museum preserved it. No monument marks the ridge where it fought. The location is farmland now, peaceful and green, the shell craters filled in, the bones of the dead removed and buried in military cemeteries where rows of white crosses mark the places where nations sent their sons to die. But the story survives, passed down through the fragments that war leaves behind. Reports, letters, photographs, memories shared in quiet moments between men who understood what it meant to face death and refuse to yield. The Tiger that wouldn't die was not a machine. It was 5 men who, for reasons they couldn't fully explain even to themselves, decided that retreat was impossible and survival was not guaranteed. So the only option left was to fight with every skill and instinct they possessed, to make every round count, to turn a doomed position into a stand that defied logic and probability. They were not heroes in the propaganda sense. They were professionals, technicians, men who understood their craft and executed it under conditions of unimaginable stress. They killed because that was the mission, and they survived because they were skilled and lucky in equal measure. War does not care about courage or skill. It consumes both with indifferent brutality. But sometimes, rarely, the prepared mind and the trained hand find a way through the chaos, not because they are special, but because they refuse to accept that death is inevitable until the moment it arrives. Müller and his crew refused that inevitability for 9 hours, and in doing so, they demonstrated something that transcends nationality or ideology, that human beings, when pushed to the edge of endurance, can sometimes find within themselves reserves of clarity and competence that surprise even themselves. The cost was 24 Soviet crews who never went home, who died doing their duty just as fiercely as the Germans. There is no triumph in that accounting, no glory in the mathematics of mutual slaughter. There is only the recognition that courage and skill existed on both sides, and that the men who fought at Kursk, German, Soviet, Romanian, Hungarian, were all caught in a machine of politics and hatred that ground them into dust, regardless of their individual valor. The Tiger that wouldn't die eventually did die, as all things do. But for one day, in one place. It stood as testament to what men could achieve when they had no choice but to be extraordinary. And that, perhaps, is the only legacy worth preserving. Not the killing, not the machines, but the human capacity to endure, to think, to fight with precision even when fear screams for panic. Müller understood this in the end. When the historian asked him what lesson he would want people to take from his experience, he thought for a moment and said simply, "That war is terrible, and that even in terrible circumstances, men can do their jobs well. But we should never create circumstances that require such things." He died in 1998, quietly, surrounded by family, far from the steppes of Russia and the smoke of burning tanks. At his funeral, no one wore uniforms. No one saluted. His grandchildren knew him only as a carpenter who built furniture with care and precision, who measured twice and cut once, who believed that good work was its own reward. But those who knew, the historians, the veterans, the men who had fought at Kursk, they remembered and they understood that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are performed not for glory, but simply because there is no other choice, and professionalism demands excellence even in the face of death. The tiger that wouldn't die was in the end a story about men who wouldn't quit. And in a war defined by industrial slaughter and ideological madness, that refusal, that insistence on doing the job well until the job could no longer be done, might be the most human thing of all.